The night my son drove away and left me to die in a freezing mountain cabin. I wasn't crying. I was counting. Counting the minutes before hypothermia would set in. Counting the lies I had believed for 30 years. Counting the exact moment I realized the child I had sacrificed everything for had become the most dangerous person in my life. He took my money, my phone, my deed. He thought he took my future. He forgot one thing. He forgot who raised him. If this story moves you, hit like, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this I want to tell you something before I begin. I am 72 years old. I have buried a husband. I have survived a house fire, a broken hip, 2 rounds of grief so heavy I thought my chest would simply collapse inward and stop working. I am not a weak woman. I was never a weak woman. But love, the particular, irrational, consuming love a mother carries for her child, that is a different kind of weight altogether. It doesn't make you strong. It makes you willing. Willing to overlook, willing to excuse, willing to stand at the window at 11 o'clock at night wondering why he hasn't called, telling yourself he's just busy, just stressed, just going through something. For 30 years I was willing. That willingness almost killed me on a Tuesday in December, in a cabin with no heat 43 miles from the nearest town, with snow coming down so hard the trees disappeared. So yes, I'm going to tell you this story. All of it. The parts that make me look foolish, and the parts that make him look like what he is. Because I spent too long protecting his image at the cost of my own survival, and I am done with that particular habit now. Let me go back to where it started. Or rather, let me go back to where I finally stopped pretending it hadn't started at all. It was the second week of November when Caleb called me about the cabin trip. I remember I was in the kitchen, standing over a pot of vegetable soup that had been simmering since noon. The late afternoon light was coming through the window at that angle that makes everything look warmer than it is. And I had the radio on low, one of those old jazz stations that plays without much commentary, just music. And for about 15 minutes before that phone rang, I had been almost peaceful. Almost. Mom. His voice was smooth. It was always smooth when he wanted something. I had learned the difference over the years between his two voices. The one that came out when things were fine, kind of absent, distracted, like I was a background noise he was accustomed to, and the one that came out when he needed something from me. That voice was warm, attentive, like a lamp being switched on. That November call was the warm voice. I've been thinking, he said, about Christmas, about how we used to go up to Dad's cabin when I was a kid. You remember that? I turned the burner down. Of course I remember that. I thought maybe we could do it again, just the two of us. Get away from everything, you know. It's been a hard year. It had been a hard year. That much was true. Caleb had lost his job in the spring, or so he said. He'd been vague about the details, which I'd learned not to press on. There had been money problems, phone calls that ended abruptly when I asked the wrong question. A girlfriend I'd met once who'd looked at me with what I can only describe as pity, which had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The cabin hasn't been used in 3 years, I said. I'm not sure what condition it's in. I'll handle everything. I'll call ahead, get the generator checked, stock it with supplies. Mom, He paused, and I heard him take a breath that sounded almost fragile. I just want to spend some real time with you, like we used to. Like we used to. If you're a parent listening to this, you know exactly what those 4 words do to a person. They don't just appeal to memory. They appeal to grief. The grief of watching your child grow into someone who doesn't need you the way they once did. The grief of Sunday dinners that stopped happening, of birthdays remembered too late, of a relationship that has been slowly hollowed out over years until what's left is mostly obligation and the ghost of something warmer, like we used to. I stirred the soup and I said, "All right, Caleb, let's go up for Christmas." I heard him exhale. "Great," he said. "That's really great, Mom." And I stood there in my warm kitchen with the jazz playing softly and the soup smelling like something good. And I told myself that this was a turning point, that my son was reaching out because he missed me, that people changed, that the distance between us was something we could close if we both wanted to. I believed every word of it. God help me. I believed every word. I should tell you about my son. Not the version I told people at church or at the grocery store. The proud mother version, the highlight reel. The actual Caleb. He was beautiful as a baby. I know every mother says that, but it was objectively true. He had dark curling hair and this expression of absolute seriousness, like he was already working something out. My husband Thomas used to say Caleb came into the world with an agenda. We laughed about that. We stopped laughing eventually. Caleb was clever from the start, not in the sweet way, not in the curious, eager way some children are clever, where they want to know how things work because the world delights them. Caleb's cleverness was more transactional. He figured out early what people wanted to hear, and he said it. He figured out what made people comfortable, and he performed it. Teachers loved him. Parents of his friends loved him. He was charming and polite and present in exactly the way that got him what he needed. And then when he didn't need anything, he went quiet. Thomas noticed it before I did. That boy keeps his cards close, he told me once, when Caleb was about 16. I can't ever tell what he's actually thinking. He's a teenager, I said. They're all like that. Thomas gave me a look that said he wasn't sure I was right, but he let it go. He let most things go with Caleb. Thomas was the kind of man who believed in giving people, especially his own son, the benefit of the doubt until the doubt became impossible to ignore. Thomas died 8 years ago. Heart attack. Quick, the doctor said, as if that was a comfort. It wasn't. Quick just means you don't get to say goodbye. After Thomas died, Caleb came back into my life in a way he hadn't been for several years. He was attentive. He called more. He came to the house and sat with me in the kitchen and talked about his father, and those were real conversations, I think. The grief was real for both of us. For a while I thought maybe losing Thomas had opened something in Caleb, cracked through whatever shell he'd built around himself, and let something genuine out. Then the estate settled. Thomas had left everything jointly to me and Caleb, the house, the small cabin property up in the mountains, a modest savings account, and a life insurance policy that was worth considerably more than modest. The kind of money that, depending on who you are, either clarifies what you value or reveals what you'd been pretending to value all along. For Caleb, it revealed. The first request came 6 months after Thomas died. He needed to borrow $20,000. An investment opportunity, he said. He'd pay it back within the year. I gave it to him. He did not pay it back within the year. The second request came 18 months after that. $35,000. His car, his rent, a business deal that required upfront capital. I asked more questions this time. He had good answers, smooth, rehearsed sounding, but not obviously so. I gave him the money. And so it went. For 8 years. I don't tell you this to make you think I was stupid. I tell you because I know some of you listening have been in this exact position, where the person taking from you is someone you love, and the taking happens so gradually, so surrounded by just enough warmth and just enough normalcy that you keep adjusting your definition of acceptable instead of recognizing you've been pushed somewhere you never agreed to go. By the time December came around, Caleb had borrowed, and I use that word carefully, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 from me over 8 years. My savings were not gone, but they were diminished in ways that kept me up at night. I had a financial advisor, a careful woman named Patricia, who had been gently raising alarms for 2 years. I had a lawyer, old friend of Thomas's named Gerald, who had said to me plainly the previous spring, "Evelyn, at some point you need to protect yourself." I had nodded and said I would think about it. I was still thinking about it on the day Caleb called about the cabin. What I had not told Caleb, what I had not told almost anyone, was that the thinking had become doing, quietly, carefully. Over the previous 4 months, I had been meeting with Gerald and with Patricia, and we had been putting things in place. A trust, documented records, a certain steel box in a certain location that Caleb had no knowledge of. I want to be very clear about something. I did not go on that cabin trip with a plan to trap my son. I went because some part of me, some stubborn, aching part, still hoped I was wrong about him, still hoped the warm voice was real. That part of me was wrong. But the cautious part of me, the part that had been quietly meeting with lawyers while the hopeful part kept soup simmering, that part turned out to be the part that saved my life. No, we left on the 23rd of December. Caleb picked me up at 8 in the morning, which surprised me. He was not typically an early riser, and punctuality had never been a particular virtue of his. But he was there at 10 minutes to 8, which was more than on time, which should have made me more alert. Instead, I read it as eagerness, as enthusiasm for the trip. The truck was already packed. He'd loaded the back with supplies. I could see bags from the grocery store, a box of firewood, a duffel bag I assumed was his clothes. He'd handled everything, just like he said he would. He even came inside and carried my suitcase to the truck without being asked, and when he held the door open for me, he smiled the way he used to smile when he was 12 and had done something he was proud of. I thought, maybe this is real. The drive up was 4 hours. The first 2 were fine. We talked about things that didn't matter much. A neighbor's new dog, a television show he'd been watching, a repair that needed to be done on my porch railing. Easy conversation, the kind that fills space without asking for anything. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, something shifted. It was subtle. He got quieter. His answers became shorter. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror in a way that seemed less like checking traffic and more like checking something internal. At one point his phone buzzed, and he declined the call without looking at who it was, which ordinarily wouldn't mean anything, but in the context of everything I now know he was planning, it was the moment the machinery began. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said. "Just tired." I looked out the window. The mountains had been swallowing the road for the last hour, and the sky had gone the particular flat white that precedes serious snow. Thomas had known that sky. He'd have recognized it immediately, turned the truck around, insisted we find somewhere lower to wait out the storm. But Caleb either didn't notice or didn't care, and I convinced myself I was being paranoid when I felt the first flutter of unease. We reached the cabin at 12:30. It was smaller than I remembered. Grief does that, shrinks the places that held happiness, because without the people who made them warm, they're just structures. The cabin was a one-room affair, solid pine construction, with a cast-iron stove in one corner and a narrow bed along the wall opposite the window. There was a small kitchen area and a bathroom that Thomas had added on 15 years ago. The generator was out back under a metal overhang. It was cold inside. Not the cold of winter air, but the cold of a space that hasn't held human warmth in years. It went into the bones immediately. "I'll get the generator going," Caleb said. He was out there for a long time. I heard him moving around, heard the generator cough and fail a few times, heard cursing I pretended not to hear. Eventually a low hum came through the walls, and the one overhead light flickered on, but the heat didn't follow. "Generator's powering the lights," Caleb said when he came back in, stomping snow off his boots. "Heating unit's shot. I didn't realize." "What do you mean you didn't realize? Didn't you say you were going to check it?" He shrugged. "I called the management company. They said everything was fine." It was not fine. The electric baseboard heaters along the walls were completely dead. The only source of heat in the cabin was the cast-iron stove, which required wood, and the wood box beside it held only 3 small logs. "Caleb," I said, "it's going to be below 20 degrees tonight." "Mom, we'll be fine. We'll keep the stove going. It'll be like camping." I am 72 years old. I do not camp. He laughed at that, genuinely laughed, and for a moment I saw the 12-year-old face flash across his adult one, and my heart did the thing it always does, that pull, that involuntary softening. And I said nothing more about it. We ate sandwiches we'd brought. Caleb made coffee on the small propane burner, and we sat at the little wooden table, and for a while it was almost nice. Almost. He asked me about things I hadn't expected, about my childhood, about how my parents had met, about what I'd wanted to be when I was young. I told him I'd wanted to be a cartographer. He didn't know what that was, and I told him, and he laughed again, less guarded this time, and said, "A map maker, that fits you." "Does it? You always knew where everything was, where everyone stood." He said it like a compliment. Later I would understand it was also an observation. He knew I could read positions. He was about to make sure his position was unreadable until it was too late. Tots. The snow started in earnest around 4 in the afternoon. By 5, the window was white. Caleb had stepped outside twice, once to bring in more wood from under the overhang. There were a few more pieces, as it turned out, not enough but a few. And once too, he said, "Check the truck." I didn't think much of that at the time. I was adding the last log to the stove, and trying to calculate how long the heat would hold. When he came back in the second time, he didn't sit down. He stood near the door with his coat still on, and something about the way he was standing, too still, weight too evenly distributed, the posture of someone who has decided something, made me set down the poker I was holding and turn to look at him fully. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." He didn't look at me when he spoke. He looked at a point past my left shoulder, which was another thing I should have named for what it was: avoidance of an informational rather than emotional kind. Avoidance that comes from rehearsal. "I have some things I need to take care of. Back in the city, something came up." The air in the cabin changed, or maybe the air stayed exactly the same and something in me changed. Some sensor that I had spent 30 years trying to muffle because the signal it sent was too painful. "What things?" I asked. "Financial stuff. It's complicated. I have to go tonight." "Tonight," I repeated it flatly. "The roads are still passable if I leave now. Once the storm fully sets in, Caleb," my voice came out quieter than I intended, "you're going to leave me here tonight alone. You'll be fine, Mom. You've got the stove, 3 logs. And the supplies we brought food for 2 people for a long weekend. What I don't have is a phone because mine needs to be charged, and you know the charger I use isn't compatible with." I stopped. Something had shifted in his face, not guilt. Something more calculated than guilt. "Actually," he said, "I need to borrow your phone. Mine's dead." I looked at him. "And there's something else." He moved then, crossing the cabin in 4 steps, going directly to the chair where I'd placed my purse. I watched him lift it. I watched him open it. I watched him take out my phone, my emergency cash, $300 I always kept folded, and a manila folder I'd brought because it contained several property documents I'd been meaning to review with Gerald. He knew what was in that folder. Or he thought he did. "Caleb." My voice had gone somewhere very cold and very steady, someplace I didn't entirely recognize. "What are you doing?" It was not a question. You know those moments when something you've half known for a long time finally lands, and instead of surprise, what you feel is a terrible and exhausted clarity. That's what came over me in that moment, like a weather system that had been building for years finally making landfall. He straightened up. He put my things in his coat pocket. He still wasn't looking at me directly. There was something that could have been shame in his profile, but it was shame wearing the costume of rationalization, which is a whole different animal from the real thing. "I need these to take care of some things," he said. "The property documents especially. I'm going to handle the financial situation. For both of us." "You're going to handle it." I said it without inflection. "Mom, this is better for you. You don't understand the full picture." "Then explain it to me." He finally looked at me. His eyes, his father's eyes, the exact same dark brown, were doing something I had no name for in that moment. Not cruelty exactly. Not indifference exactly. Something colder and more purposeful than either. The look of someone who has decided the arithmetic of the situation no longer includes you as a variable. "I'll be back in a few days," he said, "once the storm passes. You're leaving me alone in a cabin with no working heat and no phone in a snowstorm." He turned toward the door. "Caleb." I didn't raise my voice. There was no point in raising it. "If you walk out that door," he paused with his hand on the latch. "I need you to know that I understand exactly what you're doing, and I need you to know that you do not know everything you think you know." He turned then, and for a moment, one single, suspended moment, something flickered in his face that might have been uncertainty, but it was too late for uncertainty to matter because the plan he'd been building was already too far along. Men like Caleb, people who have spent years running calculations that justify taking from others, don't stop at the moment of maximum vulnerability. They go through. "You were always stronger than you looked," he said, and he opened the door, and he was gone. I stood in the center of the cabin for what I think was about 3 minutes, though it felt longer. I didn't move. The cold was already seeping under the door, which hadn't latched properly. It never had. Thomas always meant to fix it. And the stove was ticking down its heat with each passing minute. I am 72 years old, This is what I thought, standing there in the cabin my dead husband had loved, with the snow erasing the road and my son's taillights disappearing into the dark. I thought, I am 72 years old and I have never been the kind of woman who falls apart. And I am not going to start now because there is no time for it and it will not help. Grief is a luxury. Survival is a practice. Thomas taught me that, though he used different words. I looked at the stove. 3 logs, of which 2 were already burning. I needed to make them last as long as possible, and I needed to find more fuel. I needed to get warm enough to think, and I needed to think clearly enough to act. First, the door. I found an old wooden chair with a cracked leg and wedged it under the handle, which sealed the gap enough to reduce the draft. Not perfect, better. Second, layers. I went to my suitcase. I had packed for a Christmas weekend. Not an emergency, but I had also packed because I am a practical woman who does not understand packing light, which Thomas used to tease me for, and which now meant I had 3 sweaters, 2 pairs of thermal socks, and a wool scarf that had belonged to my mother. I put on everything I could put on. Third, I looked around the cabin for anything I had missed on the first look. This is where Thomas saved my life, 8 years after his death, because Thomas had been a man of particular habits. One of those habits was putting useful things in places where they would be found when needed, and then telling nobody about them because he didn't need to announce his preparations to feel confident in them. And I knew this man's habits. I had lived with him for 41 years. I had learned the grammar of him so thoroughly that even now, 8 years gone, I could walk into a space he'd created and read it. I went to the corner where the floorboard had always had a slight give. Thomas had pointed it out once, years ago, when we'd come up here for their last summer, said he needed to fix it before someone turned an ankle. He'd never fixed it. I had wondered once or twice over the years whether not fixing it was also intentional. I pressed the board. It gave. I reached into the dark space beneath it and my fingers found metal, cold and smooth and shaped like a box not much bigger than a shoebox, with a combination lock I had known the combination to for 4 years. Inside was everything Thomas had thought to leave me. A small hand-crank emergency radio, a sealed packet with waterproof matches, and a folded fire starter block, a pen light with working batteries. $40 in cash, which under the circumstances felt like a treasure. A folded paper with handwritten notes in Thomas's handwriting, maintenance notes for the cabin, phone numbers, a list of what was where. And at the bottom, under everything else, a small key on a wire ring. I sat back on my heels in the cold cabin with Thomas's box in my lap, and I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds of the grief I didn't have time for. 30 seconds. Enough. I reached for the radio. Popped it. The hand crank was stiff from years of disuse, and my hands were already cold enough to be clumsy, but I worked it until the display lit up, and then I worked it some more. And eventually a small, clear signal came through. The kind of signal that in the mountains usually requires luck, along with effort. I wasn't looking for a radio station. I was looking for a frequency. A specific frequency that I had written down 4 years ago when I gave the matching radio to Mara Quinn. Mara and I had been friends for 22 years. She'd been sheriff of the county adjacent to this one for 18 of those years before she retired, and in that capacity she had dealt with enough emergencies and enough mountain cabins to be very serious about emergency communication. When I'd started spending time up here after Thomas died, brief trips just to feel close to him, Mara had handed me a radio without ceremony and said, "You know your phone signal up there is worthless. Learn to use this." I had learned. I had also been careful to put the handwritten frequency somewhere that wasn't on my person, somewhere no one could take it with my phone. I had put it in the cabin, in Thomas's box, along with everything else I might need, because I had been paying attention, and I had suspected, and I had prepared. I found the frequency. I held the radio close and I pressed the transmit button. "Mara." My voice was steadier than I expected. "It's Evelyn. I'm in Thomas's cabin. I need you to call the county and the state police. My son took my phone and left me here in the storm. I am not injured, but I will not be warm for long." I paused. "And Mara, I need you to call Gerald." Static, then crackle. Then, unmistakably, with the particular flat authority of a woman who has been called about emergencies for most of her adult life. "Evelyn, I'm here. Don't move. I've got you. I exhaled. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Steady, indifferent, covering the tracks of my son's departure as though trying to protect him. It was too late for that. The fire was small. My hands were cold. The night was only beginning. But Thomas's box was open on my lap. And somewhere in a city 43 miles away, my son was about to discover that taking what you can see is meaningless when what matters is what you cannot. I pressed my hands flat against the floor, against the cabin my husband built and loved and quietly prepared. And I waited. I was not afraid. Afraid is what you are before you understand what you're facing. I understood now. The radio crackled and then went quiet after Mara's voice. And I sat there on the cold floor of the cabin holding that device like it was the last warm thing in the world, which in that moment it very nearly was. I need to be honest with you about those first minutes after Caleb drove away, because I have a tendency, a lifelong tendency that Thomas used to gently call my editorial habit, to reframe difficult moments in the retelling, to make myself sound more composed than I was. So, let me be truthful. I sat on that floor for longer than 30 seconds. I sat there until my knees ached from the cold boards beneath me, and my breath was coming in visible clouds and the light from the penlight was making strange shapes on the log walls. And I thought about things I should not have been thinking about if survival was my priority. I thought about the Christmas Caleb was 6 years old, and he'd woken me at 4 in the morning because he had a nightmare about losing me. He'd crawled into our bed between Thomas and me, and I'd held his small, warm body and listened to him breathe himself back to calm. And I remember thinking, this is the most important thing I will ever do, keeping this person safe, keeping him from fear. I thought about that. And then I thought about him pulling out of the cabin driveway with my phone in his coat pocket and my emergency cash and the deed folder. And the distance between those two moments felt so vast and so wrong that my mind actually flinched from it. But flinching doesn't keep you warm. And the stove was burning down. I got up off the floor. The first thing I did, once I was standing, was take a full inventory of the cabin, not a casual look around. A real inventory, the kind Thomas had trained me to do on every camping trip we'd ever taken in 41 years of marriage. You can't use what you don't know you have, he used to say. It sounded simple. It was one of the more important things I ever learned. The kitchen area yielded more than I expected. Caleb had stocked it for the weekend, and while his intent in doing so now struck me as nothing more than maintaining the appearance of normalcy until he was clear of the property, the result was actual food. Canned soup, crackers, peanut butter, coffee, a box of powdered milk that I would not touch under any circumstances. There was a propane camp stove with 2 canisters. Enough food, I estimated, for 4 days if I was careful. Maybe 5. The supply closet near the bathroom was where Thomas's notes proved most valuable. His handwriting on that folded paper was small and precise. He'd been an engineer, and his handwriting reflected it. And it directed me in order to the following: a wool emergency blanket behind the cleaning supplies, a small first aid kit on the top shelf, 2 additional propane canisters he'd stored in a sealed plastic bin, and, this one surprised me, a length of paracord and a hand warmer packet that was probably too old to work but was worth trying. I stood in that closet reading his handwriting, and for a moment the grief came back hard enough that I had to press my hand flat against the wall and breathe through it. He had written these notes for me, not for himself. He knew every inch of this cabin. He had written them for the possibility of me being here without him, and he had done it without drama, without discussion, just quietly prepared and tucked the preparation where I would find it. I know, I said out loud, to no one, to him, to whatever remained of him in the wood and stone of this place. I know. I'm moving. I moved. The cast iron stove was the heart of the problem and the heart of the solution. With only the original 3 logs and the handful of additional pieces I'd found stacked loosely against the exterior wall, damp from weather exposure, but not unsalvageable, I had maybe 4 hours of reliable heat if I managed the fire carefully. After that, the stove would go cold and the cabin temperature would drop toward the outside air, which was already, by my estimation, somewhere around 15 degrees and falling. 4 hours was enough time for Mara. Or it had to be. I built the fire deliberately, the way Thomas had shown me, which was the way his own father had shown him. a small, tight burn that generates sustained heat rather than a quick blaze that eats fuel and leaves you with ash before midnight. I sacrificed one of the drier pieces as kindling and nursed the flame until the iron began to tick and the air nearest the stove shifted from dead cold to something approaching bearable. Then I sat in the one good chair, an old Windsor chair that Thomas had bought at an estate sale, and repaired himself, replacing two of the spindles with wood from a different chair he'd found at the same sale, mixing the grains because he couldn't find an exact match, which had bothered him slightly, and which I had always loved about it. And I wrapped myself in every layer I had, and I did something that may sound strange given the circumstances. I thought carefully about my son, not with anger. Anger is clarifying in the moment, but expensive over time, and I needed to conserve every resource I had, including emotional ones. I thought about Caleb the way a person examines something they've been carrying a long time, turning it over, trying to understand its actual weight, its actual shape, not what you wanted it to be, what it is. The money he had taken from me over 8 years was not the wound. I want to be clear about that. People hear a number like $200,000, and they assume the money is the point, but the money was never the point. The money was evidence. It was the footprint of something else, something that had been wrong for a long time, growing in the dark the way mold grows, slow and patient and thoroughly committed to the task of damage. What Caleb had taken from me over 8 years was my ability to trust my own judgment. Every time I gave him money, I told myself I was choosing. Every time I excused the missing phone calls and the empty birthdays and the conversations that were really just collection calls with better manners, I told myself I was being gracious, being understanding, being the kind of mother who didn't add to her child's burden by demanding things from him. What I had actually been doing was handing over my discernment in pieces, so small and so gradual that I didn't notice how little of it remained until I found myself alone in a freezing cabin asking, when did I stop believing what I could see with my own eyes? I didn't have an answer that night. I'm not sure I have a clean answer now. But I sat with the question, which is more than I had managed in the previous several years, and I think that counted for something. The stove ticked. The wind pressed against the walls. Somewhere on the other side of 43 miles of mountain road, my son was driving toward the life he had calculated for himself. And the radio sat on the table, and I was waiting for it to speak. It was Mara who spoke first, about 40 minutes after our initial contact. Her voice came through with more static this time, the storm affecting the signal, but the words were clear enough. Evelyn, I've made the calls. State police have a unit trying to work up from the South Road, but the storm's bad. Could be 2-3 hours. County Sheriff's Office has been notified. Gerald is awake and moving. A pause. How's your heat? I pressed the transmit button. Managed, I've got maybe 3 hours of reliable fire. I can stretch it. You alone? Completely. Another pause. When Mara spoke again, her voice had dropped a register, and I heard in it the thing that long friendship produces, the ability to say the real thing without dressing it up. Evelyn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer straight. Go ahead. How long have you known? I looked at the stove. The iron was dark red with heat, which meant the fire was doing its job. Outside, a gust hit the cabin hard enough to make the penlight flicker. Since April, I said. April. She said it without judgment, just acknowledgement. Okay. And the lawyer, Gerald, he's got everything in order? Everything? Good. I could hear her moving on her end, the sound of keys, a door. I'm coming up myself. Don't argue with me. I know the mountain roads better than any deputy they've got on tonight. Mara, the storm. I have a truck with chains and 40 years of driving these mountains. You want to tell me no, you're going to have to do it louder than this radio. I didn't tell her no. What I said was, bring coffee. She actually laughed at that. The sound came through the static, warm and real, and I held on to it after the transmission ended the way you hold on to something that reminds you you're not entirely alone in the world, even when the evidence directly around you suggests otherwise. Gerald. I should tell you about Gerald. Because he is part of this story in a way that has nothing to do with law and everything to do with the particular grace of someone who tells you the truth when you're not ready to hear it and then waits patiently until you are. Gerald Huang had been Thomas's attorney for 20 years before he became mine. He was 70 himself now, semi-retired, running a small practice from the house he'd lived in for 30 years, taking clients he wanted to take and politely declining the rest. Thomas had trusted him completely, which was the highest endorsement Thomas Marlowe could give a person. Gerald will tell you what he thinks, not what you want to hear, Thomas had said. That's rarer than people appreciate. Gerald had been the one who sat across from me the previous April and said, as gently as a man can say something brutal, "Evelyn, the pattern of withdrawals from your accounts over the last 8 years represents a systematic appropriation of your financial assets by someone who has access to your trust and your affection. That is what it is. I understand you love your son. I'm asking you to also see what he is doing." I had sat in Gerald's office with the afternoon light coming through the window, and I had felt something in me that I didn't have a word for in that moment. It was not quite devastation, because devastation implies surprise. It was more like the relief and horror that comes simultaneously when a doctor finally puts a name to something you've been feeling for a long time. The diagnosis is terrible. The naming of it is also, somehow, a release. "What do I do?" I had asked. And Gerald had told me. What we built over the following months, quietly, carefully, without any indication to Caleb that anything had changed, was a legal architecture designed to do two things. First, to protect whatever remained of my assets from any further unauthorized access. Second, to document what had already happened in a form that would be meaningful to law enforcement and a court of law if it came to that. The trust Gerald drew up was structured so that any attempt by Caleb to access, transfer, or sell my primary assets would trigger an automatic freeze and notification to both Gerald and my financial institution. The accounts were restructured. The property deed was re-registered in a way that made any transfer without my active witness participation legally void. None of which Caleb knew. The folder he'd taken from my purse contained copies, deliberately placed, deliberately incomplete, not forgeries. Real documents, but versions that predated the restructuring. If he brought them to a bank or a lawyer, he would encounter questions he couldn't answer, and those questions would create a record. I had not planned the cabin trip. I had not engineered being left there. But I had been paying attention for 8 months to a son I was slowly, painfully coming to understand, and the preparation I had made with Gerald reflected that understanding. He thought he knew what he was taking. He didn't know what he was leaving behind. So, the third hour was the hardest. The fire was down to coals, and I had fed it everything usable. The damp logs had dried enough to catch. Eventually, though they smoked more than they burned, and the cabin took on a haze that made my eyes water. I'd moved the Windsor chair close to the stove and wrapped myself in the wool blanket from the closet layered over my own coat, and I was cold in the way that works into the joints first, the wrists and knees and ankles, before moving inward. I wasn't in danger yet. I had enough body heat and enough layering to stay safe for a few more hours, even without the fire. But discomfort at my age is different from discomfort at 35. At 35, you white-knuckle through it. At 72, you have to be more careful because your body doesn't have the same reserves, the same elasticity. The cold was an opponent, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. So I did what I have always done when physical conditions are beyond my immediate control. I kept my mind moving. I went through the documented evidence in my memory, piece by piece. Not to torture myself, but because understanding the full picture, holding it clearly, without the softening filters I'd used for years, was itself a form of preparation. I needed to know exactly what Caleb had done, and I needed to be willing to say it plainly, because in the hours ahead there would be moments where someone would ask me, and I would need to answer without flinching. The money was the skeleton. Over 8 years, Caleb had requested and received a first loan of $20,000 in the name of investment, a second of $35,000 for personal debt, smaller amounts, $8,000, $12,000, once just $3,000 for what he called an emergency, scattered through the middle years. A large request, which I had partially refused, of $60,000 the previous year, of which I had given $40,000. He had not asked again after that, and I had taken the silence as improvement. What I didn't know at the time, what Gerald had uncovered with the help of a forensic accountant he'd brought in, was that Caleb had also, on 2 occasions, forged my signature on withdrawal forms. Small enough amounts to fly below the automatic flag thresholds of the bank, large enough to matter. Gerald had the documentation. He had also, over the last 4 months, been quietly researching the process for having himself declared my financial power of attorney, a process that would require my active participation and consent, and which he had apparently decided he could accomplish through other means, since obtaining my legitimate consent was not going to work. The property deed was the linchpin. With the deed and the right documents, he might have been able to initiate a sale of the house before anyone caught it, particularly if I was unreachable. If, for instance, I was in an isolated mountain cabin in a storm without a phone. So the cabin trip had not been spontaneous, he had planned it. The warm phone call in November, the eagerness, the early morning pickup, all of it had been preparation. Not for Christmas. For the window of time he needed. I sat with that fact in the cold cabin, and I held it steady. My son had driven me into the mountains with the intention of leaving me there while he executed a plan he'd been developing for months. He had calculated the odds and determined that I was an acceptable loss. I want to tell you that understanding this made the grief smaller. It didn't. Understanding and grief are not mutually exclusive. I understood completely what Caleb had done, and I also, in the dark and cold of that cabin, missed the child he had been before whatever hunger or fear or deficiency of character had led him here. Those 2 things lived beside each other in my chest, and they were both real. But understanding was what I had to work with, and so understanding was what I used. The sound of a vehicle engine was so unexpected that for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again, closer, the particular laboring sound of a truck working against a grade in bad conditions. And I was on my feet and at the window before I'd consciously decided to move, pressing my face close to the glass and seeing, through the curtain of snow, a pair of headlights making their way up the cabin road. 1 vehicle. Moving slowly. Chains on the tires from the sound of it. Not a police vehicle. Wrong cadence. Too much engine for a standard squad car. This was something bigger, older, driven by someone who knew exactly what they were doing on a mountain road in a December storm. I exhaled something that wasn't quite a word. Mara Quinn was 70 years old and had driven these mountains for decades, first as a deputy, then as sheriff, now as a private citizen who had never quite stopped knowing everything that happened on these roads. She drove a 1997 Ford pickup that she had maintained with the dedication some people reserve for historic preservation, and she drove it in conditions that would have turned younger, less confident drivers around before they'd gotten 3 miles from town. She'd made it in 2.5 hours. I heard the truck stop. I heard the door. I heard boots on the steps, quick, purposeful. And then the knock, which was unnecessary given that I'd have opened the door before her hand connected with the wood. Mara Quinn was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with white hair she wore short, and a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something more interesting than pretty. She was holding a thermos in one hand and what appeared to be a sleeping bag under her other arm, and when she looked at me, really looked, the kind of assessment she'd spent a career developing, she did something I had not expected. She set the thermos and the sleeping bag on the step, and she put her arms around me. Mara was not a hugger. She'd always operated at a certain distance, warm but bounded, the professional containment that survives years of other people's crises. So the hug surprised me, and because it surprised me, because I wasn't braced for it, it got past whatever composure I'd been maintaining for the last 3 hours. I didn't collapse. I'm not built for collapsing. But I held on for a moment longer than I intended to, and when she stepped back and looked at my face, she nodded once, as if something she'd suspected had been confirmed. "You held it together," she said. "I didn't have the option not to." "That's not actually true, but you did it anyway. Come on." She picked up the thermos and sleeping bag and came inside, and I closed the door behind her and the cabin felt immediately different, warmer in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She looked at the stove. "You managed that fire yourself?" "Thomas's notes." Something moved across her face. "Smart man." She opened the thermos and handed it to me. "Drink first, then talk. You can tell me everything while I add wood to that fire, because I've been driving in the cold for 2 hours and I could use the warmth too." I wrapped both hands around the thermos and drank. The coffee was strong enough to feel like a structural event, which was exactly right. "How long until the police get here?" I asked. Mara was crouching in front of the stove, adding pieces from the small stack she'd apparently brought from her truck bed. She looked up at me sidelong. "State police, maybe another 2 hours. But Evelyn, there's something you need to know before they arrive." Her tone had changed. The warmth was still there, but underneath it was the sheriff. The one who delivered difficult news without softening it past usefulness. "What?" She sat back on her heels. "Gerald called me on the way up. He's been monitoring your accounts, the way you set up. About 40 minutes ago, there was an attempted access. Your checking account. Large withdrawal. Gerald said they tried for 60,000. The fire popped. I stared at Mara's face. "It was flagged immediately," she continued, frozen before anything went through. "The bank flagged the branch, notified Gerald per the arrangement. Police have been contacted through that channel too." She paused. "He walked into a branch office in the city, Evelyn, in person, with documents." "With the documents he took from my purse?" "Yes." I thought about Caleb walking into that bank branch. I thought about him placing my deed copies on the counter with the confidence of a man who has planned a thing carefully and expects the world to cooperate. I thought about the moment the teller's expression would have changed, and then the manager's, and about what Caleb's face would have done in response to that shift. "He doesn't know yet," I said, "that it didn't work. Not yet. But he will soon." Mara looked at me steadily. "When he finds out those accounts are frozen, he's going to have a limited number of rational choices and a larger number of irrational ones. Gerald thinks he'll try to come back here." The wind hit the cabin. The new fire was catching. I could hear it finding the wood, doing what fire does when given the right conditions. "Let him come," I said. Mara studied me for a long moment. In 22 years of friendship, she had seen me grieve and persist and compromise and occasionally be wrong about things I'd been certain of, and she knew the difference between bravado and resolve. Whatever she saw in my face in that moment, she accepted it. "All right," she said, "then we prepare for that." She reached into her coat and set something on the table beside Thomas's radio. I looked at it. Small, black, rectangular. "That's a recording device," I said. "Yes, it is. Waterproof casing. Works in temperatures down to -10. She met my eyes. "I was a law enforcement officer for over 3 decades. I know what good evidence looks like. And I know that if Caleb comes back here and you can get him to talk, really talk, the way desperate men talk when they think they've already won or already lost, that recording is going to matter." I looked at the device. I looked at the fire. I looked at Mara Quinn, who had driven 2.5 hours in a mountain blizzard because I called her on a radio her dead friend had left for me in a box under his floorboards. "I'm not sure I can do that," I said. "Sit across from him and let him talk." "I know," she said, "but I think you can, because you've been doing a version of it for 30 years. She picked up her own coffee cup. She'd brought 2, of course she'd brought 2, and held it toward me. "And because you are, as your son correctly identified, considerably stronger than you look." I touched my cup to hers. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, the wind high and insistent, the snow total, the road lost beneath it. Somewhere down that mountain, my son was sitting in a bank parking lot, or a coffee shop, or his own car, staring at a phone, watching the plan he'd built collapse piece by piece like a structure that had been undermined for months without his knowledge. Inside the cabin, the fire had caught fully now, and the warmth was beginning to move outward from the stove in real waves, and Mara was unrolling the sleeping bag and telling me to get some rest while I could, that we'd have time to talk more when I woke, that she'd stay awake and watch the road. I didn't sleep immediately. I lay on the narrow bed in all my layers with the sleeping bag pulled over me, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about the key Thomas had left in the box. The small key on the wire ring that I hadn't yet accounted for. His notes hadn't mentioned it. It opened something I hadn't found yet. I fell asleep with that question open, which is sometimes the best you can do. Leave the unresolved things somewhere safe in your mind and trust that the answer will be there when you need it. The fire burned steady. Mara sat in Thomas's Windsor chair, and the mountain held us both while the storm spent itself against the walls. I woke to the sound of Mara's voice, low and clipped, The way it got when she was on the phone with someone she was being professionally careful with. The fire had been rebuilt while I slept. I could tell by the quality of the heat, the steady radiance of it rather than the thin remnant warmth I'd fallen asleep to. Someone had also tucked the edge of the sleeping bag more firmly around my shoulders at some point, which was such a quietly human thing that it took me a moment to process it without feeling something. The light through the cabin window was different. Still dark, but the texture of the dark had changed. The deep black of storm hours had thinned to something grayer. The particular murk that comes before dawn starts making up its mind. I lay still and listened to Mara's half of the conversation. How certain are you on that? A pause. All right, and the plates? Another pause, longer. That's what I thought. Yes. Don't do anything until I call you back. She set the phone down on the table and turned to find me watching her. How long have you been awake? She asked. Long enough, I said. Who was that? She didn't answer immediately. She went to the propane stove, checked the coffee she'd apparently made while I slept, and poured a cup. She brought it to me before she spoke, which told me she wanted me to have something solid in my hand before she said what she was going to say. That was Deputy Reyes, she said. He has a unit parked at the lower checkpoint where the state road meets the mountain road. That road has been technically impassable since around 10 last night. I sat up. Technically. Meaning the official position is that no civilian vehicle should be attempting it. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. About 40 minutes ago, a vehicle matching Caleb's truck went through the checkpoint on a service access road that branches off about 2 miles south. Older route, not officially maintained in winter. Reyes says it's barely a road at all right now. The cold in my stomach had nothing to do with the temperature. He's coming back. He's on his way up, yes. I sat with that for a moment. The coffee was real and strong, and I held it with both hands and made myself drink before I spoke again. The bank flagged him. Gerald confirmed it about an hour ago. Caleb was at the branch for roughly 20 minutes. They stalled him as long as they could, claimed system issues, asked him to wait, that kind of thing, while they contacted the fraud unit. By the time he understood what was happening, he'd already given them his name and shown the documents. Mara looked at me steadily. There's a formal report filed now, but Evelyn, he left before police arrived at the branch. They don't have him yet. So he knows the accounts are frozen. He knows, and he knows someone put them that way, which means he knows the documents he took are worth nothing without your cooperation. She paused. He needs you to sign something. That's the only move he has left. That landed with a weight I had to consciously put down. My son was driving up a near impassable mountain road in a December storm, not because he was worried about me, but because I was the last obstacle between him and what he wanted. I had gone from being his mother to being a transaction. And even understanding that fully, even having understood it for months in the abstract, having it become concrete, having it become headlights on a mountain road, was something different. How long do we have? I asked. Mara glanced at the window. Service road adds significant time. Road conditions are terrible. I'd say we have between 40 minutes and an hour before he gets here. She reached into her coat on the chair beside her and produced the recording device she'd set on the table the previous night. Reyes and another deputy are coming up the main road from the checkpoint. Slower going than Caleb's route, but they're in better vehicles. I'd estimate they arrive about 30 minutes behind him, maybe 20 if they push. I looked at the device. You're telling me there's a window. I'm telling you there's a window. I understood what she wasn't saying directly, because after 22 years we'd reached the point where the unsaid parts were as clear as the rest. If Caleb arrived here before the deputies, if there were 30 minutes where it was just the three of us in this cabin, what happened in those 30 minutes would matter enormously. A desperate man confronted without witnesses had one set of behavioral options. A desperate man who didn't know he was being recorded had another. Mara had spent 30 years understanding which conditions produced which confessions. I need to know something, I said. Ask. Is this legal? The recording. If he doesn't know, this state is a one-party consent jurisdiction, she said, meaning one party to the conversation needs to consent to the recording. You're a party to the conversation. You consent. It's admissible. She said it with the flat efficiency of someone who had navigated this question many times professionally, but she also looked at me directly when she said it, which I took to mean, I've made sure of this. You can trust it. I nodded. All right, I said. Then we prepare for that. She almost smiled, just the corner of it. You said that last night. I meant it last night, too. I got up out of the sleeping bag, moved to the bathroom to do what could be done without running water. The pipes had frozen at some point overnight, which I discovered without great surprise, and when I came back out, I looked different than I had. I looked like myself, which is what I was going for. Not polished, not performed, just 72 years old and present and not afraid. Because the woman who had spent 30 years making herself small and accommodating in her son's presence was not the woman who had survived last night, and I was not going to let him walk in here and find the version he expected. Mara had moved the Windsor chair to the corner, angled slightly. The recording device sat in the shadow of Thomas's radio, small enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. Where do you want to sit? She asked. I looked around the cabin, considered it. At the table. Good. She nodded once. Strong position. He'll have to stand or sit across from you. Either way, you hold the room. She looked at me. I'm going to be in the back corner, out of his immediate sight line when he comes in. I'll stay back unless it becomes something else. Yes. I sat at the table. I poured another cup of coffee, which was perhaps my fourth since Mara arrived, and I placed my hands flat on the table surface the way I used to do in difficult meetings when Thomas was still alive and I went with him occasionally to the engineering firm where he worked. And someone was being difficult. And I'd learned early that the most powerful thing a woman in a room full of difficult men can do is take up deliberate, unhurried space. Hands flat, back straight, eyes forward, waiting. He came in 38 minutes later, which meant he'd pushed the service road faster than Mara had estimated, which told me something about his state of mind. Caleb had always been a careful driver. The fact that he wasn't being careful now was information. I heard the truck before I saw the lights. The engine was running too high. He was riding the accelerator harder than the road deserved. And when the headlights swept through the window, they came in at a wrong angle, slightly sideways, which meant he'd come off the road briefly and corrected. When he came to a stop, it was abrupt, the brake too hard, the kind of stop you make when your mind is moving faster than your hands. The door of the truck opened and shut, hard, boots on the steps, fast, not Thomas's measured tread, not Mara's purposeful rhythm. These were the footsteps of someone in the part of panic that presents as aggression. The door opened. The chair was no longer against it. Mara had moved it when we'd heard the engine. And Caleb came in with the cold behind him, and he stopped when he saw me. I held his gaze, and I did not speak first. His face was a complicated thing in that moment. He looked worse than when he'd left. The careful smoothness of him was fractured, his hair wet from the storm, his coat open like he'd been too agitated to close it properly. There was something around his eyes that I recognized from when he was a child, and had done something he knew was wrong and was calculating, in real time, whether he could get out ahead of the consequences. He had always been a better calculator than a human being. He looked around the cabin. He saw Mara. Something shifted in him. A quick recalibration, the kind that happens when you've planned a conversation and arrived to find a variable you didn't account for. Mom, he said. His voice was working to find the smooth register and not quite getting there. I'm glad you're okay. When I heard the storm got worse, Caleb. I said it quietly. Sit down. The instruction surprised him. He'd expected, I think, something more emotional from me. Tears, accusations, the kind of high-register confrontation that he was accustomed to managing. The flat instruction to sit down came from somewhere he didn't immediately recognize. He sat, not comfortably, at the edge of the chair across from me, coat still on, wet and off balance. Mara, I said, without looking away from my son. Could you give us a few minutes? Mara moved to the back of the cabin without a word. I heard her settle. Caleb's eyes tracked her briefly, then came back to me. Mom, he started again. I need to explain. The bank called, I said. His mouth closed. Well, I clarified, Gerald called, which amounts to the same thing. The branch flagged the attempt before anything went through. I lifted my coffee cup and took a sip and set it back down. Even and deliberate. The documents you took from my purse were outdated copies. The trust restructuring was completed in October. Those accounts have been unreachable by anyone except me since then. Caleb stared at me. The calculation behind his eyes was running fast. I could almost see it, the rapid reassessment of what I knew, what I'd done, how long I'd been doing it. You planned this, he said. I planned to protect myself, yes. You set me up. His voice shifted into something that wanted to be righteousness and landed closer to desperation. You had this whole thing arranged, the trust, the accounts, and you let me take you up here without telling me any of it. You left me in a freezing cabin without heat and without a phone, I said. In a storm, alone. He didn't answer that directly. People who have been doing wrong for a long time develop a particular skill for not engaging with the clearest evidence of it. They pivot, they reframe. I wasn't going to leave you there for long, he said. I was going to come back. You came back because the bank froze the accounts. That's not... He stopped, started again. Mom, you don't understand the situation I'm in, financially. It's bad. It's really bad. I owe people, not good people. And if I don't, how much? I asked. He blinked. What? How much do you owe? To these people who aren't good people. He looked at the table. Some emotion moved through his face that might have been genuine shame, the first I'd seen, and he said quietly, a lot. More than I can cover. I've made some bad choices and it's gotten out of hand and I needed the money from the sale of the house to my house. The family house. Mom, that house has equity we've never... It is my house, Caleb. I heard my own voice sharpen, and I let it, not into shouting, into precision. It is the house your father and I bought 33 years ago. It is the house where you grew up, where I nursed you through every illness, where I watched your father die in the room at the end of the hall. It is mine, and you were going to sell it without my knowledge while I was stranded on a mountain. He had the grace to look at the table when I said that. I know, he said. I know how it sounds. How does it sound? He looked up, and for a moment I saw something I hadn't expected. Not remorse exactly, but something adjacent to it. A kind of exhausted recognition, like a man who has been running so hard in one direction that he hasn't looked at where he was going, and has suddenly looked and doesn't like what he sees. It sounds terrible, he said. It is terrible. Silence. The fire ticked. Outside, the storm had dropped from its peak into something steadier. Still heavy snow, but less violent. The wind had pulled back. What I want to know, I said, and I kept my voice even, because even was what the moment needed, is when you decided I was an obstacle rather than your mother. I want to know when that shift happened, because I've been going back through years of our relationship and trying to find the moment, and I can't locate it clearly, and it matters to me. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, unexpectedly, he said, I don't know. I don't think it was one moment. Tell me what you do know. Another silence. He was doing something I hadn't seen him do in years, actually thinking rather than calculating. The difference is visible if you know the person. Thinking has a different quality of stillness than calculating. I always knew Dad was the one who really saw me, he said slowly. You loved me. I know that. But Dad understood me in a way that, and when he died, I needed something. Money wasn't the thing I needed. I know that now. But it was the thing I could take. He shook his head. That doesn't make it right. No, I said, it doesn't. I kept thinking I'd fix it, pay it back, get myself into a better position, and then... He stopped. I kept moving the line of when I'd fix it, and then there wasn't any more line to move. I looked at my son. I looked at the wet coat and the frightened eyes, and the face that still, underneath everything it had become, had the shape of the child I had loved completely and without reservation for his entire life. And I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because the honest answer is more complicated than the story wants it to be. I felt grief. Real, structural grief, the kind that settles in the body rather than the eyes. I felt something that was not forgiveness, but was in the same family as it. a kind of releasing of the need to understand it all in one sitting. And I felt, underneath all of it, a hard and careful clarity that I had been building for 8 months in Gerald's office and in late-night conversations with Mara and in the quiet of my own house when I was honest with myself. That loving someone does not mean being consumed by them. That a mother's love, which is real and which I will not diminish, is not the same as a mother's obligation to surrender everything she has and is to a person who has stopped treating her as a person. Caleb, I said, I need you to listen to me carefully because I'm only going to say this once and I'm going to say all of it. He looked at me. I love you. That has not changed and it will not change because love is not a switch and I am not the kind of woman who turns it off. But love is not the same as unlimited access. Love is not a blank check. Love is not the same as standing by while someone destroys me. My voice was steady. I was proud of that, under the circumstances. What you have done over these 8 years, and what you attempted to do last night and this morning, is not something I can fix for you. It is not something I am able to absorb anymore. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He was very still. The police are on their way here, I said. They will be here within the next 20 to 30 minutes. When they arrive, I'm going to cooperate fully with their investigation. I'm going to provide everything Gerald and I have documented, and I am not going to intervene in what happens next because I no longer believe that my intervention protects you. I think it has only ever delayed consequences that you needed to face. Mom, let me finish. I leaned forward slightly. The one thing I want from you right now, tonight, the only thing I am asking is honesty, not performance, not the voice you use when you want something, actual honesty, because you and I are past the point where performance is useful to either of us. I held his gaze. Did you understand when you left me here last night that I might not survive the night? The question landed in the cabin like a stone into still water. He didn't answer for a long time, and then in a voice I had to strain to hear. I told myself you would be okay. I told myself you were strong enough. I told myself... He stopped. I don't know what I actually believed. I think I didn't let myself think about it. Because if you thought about it clearly, you couldn't do it. Yes. But you did it anyway. He couldn't say yes to that one. He looked at his hands instead, which was itself a kind of answer. I sat back. The clarity in me was very still now. Not cold, not the cold of indifference, but the stillness that comes when you have finally stopped fighting the truth of something and let it be what it is. I want you to know, I said quietly, that I found Thomas's box. Caleb's eyes came up. He didn't know what that meant, and his not knowing was itself significant. It confirmed that the box, and everything in it, had been invisible to him. Which meant Thomas had known, on some level, that Caleb was not someone to be trusted with the location of safety equipment. Thomas, who gave the benefit of the doubt to nearly everyone, had made an exception for his own son, and had done it quietly, and had left me the result. The small key on the wire ring. It had been in my coat pocket since I'd woken up. There's something else in this cabin, I told him. Your father left it for me. I think he knew. Not everything, but enough. I think he was trying to make sure I wasn't alone if things went wrong. I looked at the corner where Thomas had built in a small storage bench along the wall, the kind that looks like nothing, like part of the structure. That key opened something. I watched Caleb's face for the calculation, and it wasn't there. That absence was one of the more surprising things about the conversation. There were moments in it where Caleb was, however briefly, not calculating. Just present. Just a person in the wreckage of what he'd built, looking at his mother. "What's in it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "I was going to open it this morning." We looked at each other across the small table in the cabin where his father had loved us both imperfectly and faithfully. And for that one moment, the transaction fell away and what remained was just the true shape of things. A mother and a son who had taken diverging roads for a long time and had arrived here, in the cold and the early dark, at the place where roads converge whether you want them to or not. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it. His face changed. I knew from the change what it was before he said anything. The calculation came back, fast and hard, but different from before. Not the smooth calculation of a man executing a plan, but the frantic calculation of a man discovering his position is worse than he knew. "That's the fraud unit," he said. "They flagged my accounts too." Of course they had. Gerald had been thorough. The documented pattern of withdrawal, including the 2 forged signatures, had been provided to the Financial Crimes Unit 2 weeks earlier, pending developments. Gerald had always said the goal was not to punish Caleb, but to stop the hemorrhage and create a record. If Caleb forced the issue by attempting a major fraudulent transaction, the record would speak. He had forced the issue. "Caleb," I said. He was already standing, the phone in his hand, doing that rapid assessment thing again. Eyes moving, calculating exit, calculating options. The trapped animal quality was back, and it was worse than before because now the cage was smaller. "Caleb," sharper this time. He stopped. "There's nowhere to go," I said. "The main road has a checkpoint. The service road you came up is now behind you, and I'd imagine they know you used it. Running is going to make everything worse, and you know it." I kept my voice level. "Sit down." He stood for one more moment, suspended between the version of himself that wanted to run and the version that was, somewhere under everything, still my son, still the person who understood when something was genuinely over. He sat down. He put his face in his hands. I did not go to him. I want to be honest about that. Every instinct I had as his mother said to go to him, to put my hand on his back the way I had when he was small and sick or frightened, to offer the physical comfort that children absorb without knowing they need it. I felt that instinct fully, and I sat with it, and I did not act on it. Because the thing I had learned, the thing that living with gradual destruction teaches you if you let it, is that comfort offered in the wrong moment is not kindness. It is prevention. It prevents the person in front of you from sitting in the full weight of what they've done, and sitting in that weight, however agonizing, is the only beginning of anything real. I let him sit with it. Mara had moved quietly from the back corner and was now at the window, looking out toward the road. She said without turning around, "Lights on the main road. 2 vehicles. Probably 7-8 minutes out." 7 minutes. I looked at my son with his face in his hands, and I looked at the corner where Thomas's storage bench held the last unknown thing in that cabin. And I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. I crossed the cabin and crouched in front of the bench and put Thomas's small key into the lock. It turned on the first try. Of course it did. Thomas Marlowe was not a man who left things in disrepair. The bench opened. Inside, wrapped in an oilskin cloth and sealed with a rubber band that had dried and cracked with age, was a letter in Thomas's handwriting. Beneath it, a smaller sealed envelope marked in the same hand. Not with my name, but with Caleb's. I stared at that envelope for longer than I could account for. Thomas had known. Not everything. I don't think he'd known the specific shape of what would come, but he'd known enough to write his son a letter and seal it and leave it somewhere Caleb would only find it if I chose to give it to him. He'd known that eventually we would arrive at a moment like this one, and he'd left something in it, the way he left things everywhere, quietly, practically, without announcement. I picked up both letters and stood. Caleb had lifted his face from his hands. He saw what I was holding. He saw his name on the smaller envelope, and something happened in his face that was not calculation and was not performance. It was raw in a way I hadn't seen on his face in 20 years. "Is that—" His voice broke on it. He stopped, tried again. "Is that from Dad?" "Yes," I said. Outside, the lights Mara had spotted were getting closer. The sound of engines was becoming audible over the wind. Official vehicles, moving with purpose through the remaining snow. I held the envelope out across the table. "This is yours," I said. "Whatever is in it, your father meant it for you, not me." I set it on the table between us. "But I need you to understand something, Caleb. Reading this letter, having this piece of your father, is not something I owe you. It's something I'm choosing to give you. There's a difference. Do you hear me?" He was looking at the envelope like a man looking at something he doesn't have the right to want. "Do you hear me?" I asked again. Slowly he nodded. The engines outside were very close now. Mara said, "Evelyn." Just my name. Just a heads up. I straightened up and put Thomas's letter, the one addressed to me, inside my coat, against my chest, where it would stay until I was somewhere private enough to read it. Then I went to the table and I picked up my coffee cup and I stood in the cabin my husband had built and loved and quietly prepared, and I waited for the knock on the door. Caleb sat across the table with his father's letter in his hands, unopened. The knock came, and I walked to the door and I opened it, and Deputy Reyes was standing on the steps with snow on his shoulders and a look that had been trained into careful neutrality, and behind him was another officer, and behind them was the gray pre-dawn light beginning finally to separate itself from the dark. "Mrs. Marlowe?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Come in. My son is at the table. He's going to cooperate." I stepped back to let them enter. "I need you to understand. I want to be very clear about everything that happened. I have documentation, and there is a recording of our conversation tonight. I'll provide all of it." I paused. "But I need 5 minutes before we begin. There's something I need to witness." Reyes looked at me with the careful expression of someone deciding whether to grant a civilian request. He was young, late 30s maybe, and he had the look of someone who had been well-trained and still had enough humanity left to use judgment. He nodded. I went back to the table. I sat across from my son. I folded my hands. "Open it," I said. Caleb's hands were not steady, but they opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages long. I know this because I watched Caleb unfold it with hands that had not been steady since he'd walked back through that door, and I could see from across the table that Thomas had filled both sides of 2 sheets of his engineering paper, the graph-lined kind he'd used for everything from structural calculations to grocery lists, because he never saw the point in buying separate notebooks for separate purposes. The handwriting was small and precise and utterly familiar, and seeing it from across a table in a mountain cabin at 5 in the morning, in the company of my arrested son and 2 sheriff's deputies and my oldest friend, was one of the stranger experiences of my life. I looked away while Caleb read. This was deliberate. Whatever Thomas had written to his son was not mine to witness, even now, even after everything. Thomas had sealed it separately for a reason. Deputy Reyes stood near the door with his partner, and they were being professionally patient in the way that good officers learn to be. Present without pressing, waiting without making the wait into a performance. Reyes had his notebook out, but wasn't writing in it yet. He was watching the room with the particular attention of someone who understands that what happens in the minutes before the official interview begins is often more revealing than the interview itself. Mara had made more coffee. I don't know when she'd done it, somewhere in the last few minutes while I'd been focused on the letter. But there was a fresh pot on the propane burner, and she set a cup near each of the deputies without comment, which they accepted with the brief nods of people who have been working through the night and are not too proud to acknowledge it. I held my own cup, and I did not watch my son read his dead father's words, but I was aware of him, the way you are always aware of the people you love, even when you're looking somewhere else. I heard the quality of his breathing change somewhere in the middle of the first page. I heard him stop and then start again. I heard once the very small sound that men make when something hits them in a place they thought was protected. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands and stared at the table. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, he knew. I looked at him. "He knew what I was," Caleb said. Not with anger, with a kind of hollowed-out wonder. He doesn't say it that way. He never says anything that way, but he saw me clearly, and he wrote it down, and he loved me anyway, and he stopped, pressed his lips together, looked at the ceiling in the way men do when they're fighting something that wants to come out of their eyes. "He says he's sorry. That's what gets me. He says he's sorry he didn't talk to me directly while he had the chance. He says he was afraid of pushing me away." A sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. He was afraid of pushing me away. I said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. "He tells me to take care of you," Caleb continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a murmur. "He says you're going to need someone to take care of you, and he knows he's asking a lot, and he's sorry he can't do it himself." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since the funeral, since the graveside, since the afternoon we'd stood together in the cold and watched Thomas go into the ground. "He trusted me with you." "Yes," I said. "And I—" He couldn't finish it. "I know," I said. The fire ticked. The cabin was warm now. Genuinely warm in a way it hadn't been in hours. Mara's rebuilt fire doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Outside, the snow had stopped entirely at some point while none of us were paying attention to it. The mountain had gone quiet. Deputy Reyes cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Marlowe, when you're ready." I put my cup down. I straightened in my chair, and I looked at my son one more time, at the letter in his hands, at his father's handwriting on paper that had been waiting 8 years in a locked bench in a mountain cabin for this exact morning. "I'm ready," I said. "Well," what followed was not dramatic in the way the night had been dramatic. Investigations rarely are. There's a procedural quality to them. Questions asked in a specific order, documents requested, statements given and recorded, that is almost deliberately ordinary, as though the law understands that the emotional intensity of a situation needs to be handled somewhere separate from the factual accounting of it. Deputy Reyes was thorough and professional and genuinely kind in a way that didn't compromise his thoroughness. He asked me to walk through the events of the previous day from the moment Caleb had picked me up at my home, and I did, clearly and in sequence, and I watched him write, and I didn't soften anything. Not because I wanted to harm Caleb, I want to be clear about that, but because I had made a decision in the dark hours of that night that softening was finished. It had been my primary mode for 30 years and it had not served either of us, and I was done with it. Mara provided the recording without ceremony, just handed it to Reyes in its waterproof casing and said, "One-party consent jurisdiction, full conversation between Mrs. Marlowe and her son from approximately 4:40 a.m. until your arrival. Chain of custody is clean." Reyes took it with a look that told me he and Mara had probably worked together at some point in their respective careers, and he trusted her professional judgment. The documents were the other piece. Gerald had emailed a complete file to Reyes's department contact the previous night. Everything, organized the way Gerald organized everything, which was with the methodical thoroughness of a man who has spent 50 years understanding that the difference between a successful legal case and an unsuccessful one is almost always preparation. Bank records, withdrawal patterns, the forensic accountant's analysis, documentation of the 2 forged signatures, the timeline of asset transfers, the trust restructuring, all of it. Caleb, to his credit, and I give him this credit because I believe in accuracy, not because it changes the fundamental accounting of what he'd done, did not attempt to deny anything in any useful way. There was a moment early in Reyes's questioning when he started a sentence that might have been heading toward a reframing, and then he stopped himself and looked at his father's letter on the table and didn't finish it. After that, he answered what was asked, briefly and without elaboration. It took 2 hours. By the time Reyes had everything he needed, the mountain light was coming in through the cabin window in the thin gold way it does in winter, when the sun is low and the air is very clear after a storm has cleaned it. It was objectively beautiful. I noticed this and then felt slightly absurd for noticing it, and then decided that noticing beauty in the middle of difficult things is not absurd. It is necessary. When Reyes asked Caleb to stand up, Caleb stood. He didn't look at me while Reyes explained what would happen next. The transport down the mountain, the formal processing, the charges being filed. He stood with his father's letter folded in his coat pocket, which Reyes had permitted when Caleb asked quietly if he could keep it, and he looked at the floor or the wall or the middle distance. But just before they moved toward the door, he stopped. "Mom." I looked at him. He didn't have a speech. I could see he'd been trying to put one together and hadn't managed it, which was actually more honest than a speech would have been. What he said, in the end, was simple. "I'm sorry I didn't take care of you, like he asked." It was not enough. It was also real. Those two things can both be true about the same moment, and I've learned to let them be. "I know," I said. He nodded once, and then Reyes moved him toward the door, and Caleb walked out of the cabin into the clean mountain morning, and I sat at Thomas's table, and I held my coffee cup with both hands, and I let the silence settle around me like something I'd earned. Mara stayed until the deputies' vehicles were out of sight down the road. Then she came back in and sat in the Windsor chair and looked at me for a long moment. "You need to eat something," she said finally. "I know. I brought eggs and actual bread, not the powdered milk situation." I saw the powdered milk. I was not going to touch it. Smart woman. She was already at the camp stove, moving with the unhurried competence of someone who has fed themselves in difficult field conditions for decades. The smell of eggs cooking in that cabin, at that hour, after that night, was one of the better things I can remember. We ate without talking much, which is the particular gift of long friendship, the ability to share a meal without filling it with words that aren't necessary. The morning light strengthened. The snow outside the window was unbroken white in every direction, deep and still, and the trees stood in it with the patient gravity of things that have survived many storms. I had Thomas's letter in my coat, against my chest. I had not read it yet. "Are you going to open it?" Mara asked. "Not yet." I looked at my plate. I need to be somewhere I can fall apart, if it comes to that, and I'm not there yet. Fair. She poured more coffee. Gerald is going to call when he's in his office. He wants to walk you through the next steps. I know. There are a lot of them. Legal proceedings take time. The charges are serious: fraud, financial exploitation of an elderly person, potentially elder endangerment given last night. It's going to be a process. I looked at her. Mara, I know. She nodded. Just making sure you're not building a picture that has too clean an ending. I am not a woman who builds pictures with clean endings, I said. I am a woman who just survived a night in a freezing cabin on 3 logs and a hand-crank radio. I am comfortable with things being complicated. She almost smiled again, the corner of it. Thomas used to say you were the least sentimental romantic he'd ever met. He meant it as a compliment. He absolutely did. I looked at the window, at the white stillness of the mountain after the storm. What he wrote to Caleb, I said slowly. Whatever it was, it hit something real. I could see it. I don't know if it's enough to matter in the long run, but it hit something. That's Thomas, Mara said simply. Yes, I said. That's Thomas. The drive down the mountain was nothing like the drive up. Mara drove. I was in no condition to drive and didn't argue about it, which she noted without comment. And the road, now that the storm had stopped, was navigable in a way it hadn't been for the previous 12 hours. The snowplows had come through on the main road sometime after dawn, and while the surface was still uncertain, it was passable. I watched the mountain through the passenger window as we descended, and I thought about the fact that I had come up this road less than 24 hours earlier with a version of hope I can now see clearly for what it was. A hope that had been kept on life support far past its natural end, fed by my own need rather than any evidence. The hope that Caleb was reaching out. The hope that something was changing. That hope was gone now. And I want to tell you, I want to be honest with you about this, the way I have tried to be honest about everything else. Its absence was not what I expected. I had assumed that when hope finally died, what would come was grief. And grief was there. But underneath the grief was something I hadn't anticipated. Relief. The specific relief of a woman who has stopped waiting, who has stopped monitoring every interaction for signs of the things she wanted to see, who no longer has to perform the mental gymnastics of making the available evidence fit the conclusion she needed. I was done waiting for my son to become someone he had shown me, repeatedly and clearly, he was not going to be. And the freedom in that, the terrible, sad, genuine freedom, was something I had not given myself permission to feel in years. You've gone quiet, Mara said. Thinking. Good thoughts or difficult ones? Both, I said. Simultaneously. She nodded like that made complete sense, which it did. About halfway down the mountain, my phone, Mara had a spare in her truck, a basic model she kept for exactly these situations, rang with Gerald's number. Evelyn. His voice was measured, the way it always was, but I could hear something underneath it that might have been relief. Are you all right? I'm functional, I said. That's the accurate answer. That's a better answer than I was afraid of at 2 a.m. A pause. The charges have been filed. Fraud, financial exploitation, and the DA is looking at the abandonment issue seriously. There's precedent for elder endangerment in situations involving deliberate isolation. It's a strong case, Evelyn. What you and I built over these 8 months, the documentation, it's solid. The recorded conversation from last night is significant. I know. I want to talk to you about the coming weeks. There will be proceedings. You'll need to give a formal statement that's more detailed than what you gave the deputies this morning. There will be media attention, possibly. This type of case tends to attract it. I want to prepare you for that. Gerald, I said it gently, can we do all of that on Monday? A beat. Of course. Today I'd like to go home. Of course, he said again, and the two words were different the second time. Warmer, more human. Call me when you're back in the city. I'll be available. I ended the call and put the phone in my lap and looked out the window at the mountain receding behind us, and I thought about home. My house. The one Thomas and I had bought 33 years ago. The one at the end of a quiet street with the porch railing that needed fixing, and the kitchen window that caught the afternoon light, and the room at the end of the hall where Thomas had died, and where I sometimes still stood in the doorway for a minute before I went to bed, not really knowing why, just doing it. That house was still mine. In the end, despite everything Caleb had attempted, despite 8 years of gradual taking, despite the bank visits and the forged signatures and the night in the mountain cabin, the house was still mine. The accounts were frozen but intact. The trust was solid. Gerald had built it well. The preparation had held. What I felt about that was not triumph. Triumph would have required a contest I'd wanted to enter. What I felt was something quieter. The particular satisfaction of a person who did the hard, unglamorous work of protecting themselves when it was painful to do so, and discovered that the work mattered, that the hours in Gerald's office, the difficult conversations, the willingness to look at what I'd been refusing to look at, it had all added up to something real. You're smiling, Mara said. Slightly, I admitted. Want to tell me why? Thomas always said good preparation is its own form of courage, I said. I told him that sounded like something an engineer would say. It does sound like something an engineer would say. He wasn't wrong, though. She made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Mara Quinn generally got in the morning. No, he was not wrong. We were 20 minutes from the city when my phone rang again. Not Gerald this time. A number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go. Then something, instinct or the particular exhausted openness that comes after a night like the one I'd had, made me answer. Mrs. Marlowe? A woman's voice. Young, professional, slightly hesitant in the way of someone who knows they're making an unusual call. My name is Sandra Cho. I'm a reporter with the County Register. I understand you were involved in an incident last night involving... How did you get this number? I asked. A source at the Sheriff's Department. I apologize for calling so soon. I know the circumstances were serious, but I wanted to reach out before... Ms. Cho, I said. I appreciate you calling. I'm not ready to speak with the media today. I'll have Gerald Huang's office contact you with a statement when we're prepared to make one. I paused. But I want to say one thing, and you may quote this directly if you choose to. A brief silence. Of course. What happened to me last night happens to elderly people in this country more often than most people want to believe. Financial exploitation by family members. Isolation. The systematic erosion of a person's autonomy and resources by someone they love and trust. It is not rare. It is not exceptional. And the people it happens to are frequently ashamed to speak about it because it implicates someone they love, or because they believe they should have known better, or because they are afraid no one will believe them over a family member. I let that sit for a moment. I'm not ashamed. I should have acted sooner than I did, but I'm not ashamed. And I would like people who are in similar situations to understand that documentation, legal preparation, and trusted allies make the difference between surviving something like this and not surviving it. That is what I want people to know. Sandra Cho was quiet for a moment. Then, Mrs. Marlowe, can I ask, will you be willing to speak more fully at some point? Not today, but at some point. I looked out the window at the city beginning to appear at the edges of the road. The first gas station, a highway sign, the particular density of things that signals you have come back from somewhere. Yes, I said. At some point. Have Gerald's office call you. I ended the call. Mara had heard all of it. She said nothing for a minute, focused on navigating the ramp from the mountain road onto the city highway. Then, you know that's going to be a story. I know. Could get complicated. Mara, my son left me in a freezing cabin and stole my money. Complicated is already the baseline. She drove. Right. My house was exactly as I'd left it, which sounds obvious but isn't. There's a specific anxiety that comes from having been through what I'd been through, where you half expect the physical world to have rearranged itself to match the rupture in the other kind of order. But the house was the same. The porch railing still needed fixing. The key still stuck slightly in the lock before giving. Inside, the kitchen light was on. I always leave the kitchen light on when I'm away, which Thomas used to tease me about. Who are you leaving it on for? And which I'd kept doing after he died because the alternative was coming home to a dark house, and I had decided, quietly and without making a production of it, that I was not going to do that to myself. Mara came in with me and stayed long enough to make sure the heat was working and that I had actual food in the refrigerator and that I was, in her estimation, stable enough to be left alone. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat on and her keys in her hand and looked at me the way she looked at things she was genuinely worried about and trying not to show. "Call me tonight," she said. "Not because I think something will happen. Just call me." "I will. And read the letter when you're ready, not before." I touched my coat, where Thomas's letter was still folded against my chest. I'd had it there all morning without reading it. Not because I was afraid of it, but because I understood that some things require the right kind of stillness, and I hadn't been still yet. "I know," I said. She left. I heard her truck reverse down the driveway, heard it straighten and move away. And then the street was quiet in the particular way of a winter afternoon when the snow has stopped and there's no wind and everything is just sitting with the aftermath of itself. I went to the kitchen table. I sat down. I put Thomas's letter on the table in front of me. It was sealed with the kind of tape that gets brittle with age, and it came open almost without effort. Inside was the same graph-lined paper, the same small, precise handwriting, and I looked at it for a moment before I began reading. Just looked at it. Because the handwriting alone was Thomas, was his whole personhood in some concentrated form, and I needed a breath before I let it in. "Evelyn," he had written, "if you're reading this, then whatever I was worried about has happened. And I want to start by saying I'm sorry. Not for dying. I know you'd tell me that's not something to apologize for, and you'd be right, but I'm sorry anyway in that stubborn way of mine that you've been tolerating for 4 decades. I'm sorry I didn't say everything I needed to say while I had the chance. What I needed to say was this. I know what Caleb is. I have known for longer than I admitted to you, and my silence about it was a failure. I told myself I was protecting both of you. I think I was protecting myself from a conversation I didn't know how to have. That was wrong of me. I put something that was hard for me ahead of something that was necessary for you, and I've had time to think about that, and I believe it cost you. I want you to know something clearly, because I think you have spent years doubting it. You are not responsible for who Caleb became. You loved him correctly. You loved him fully. What he is came from somewhere inside him that neither of us could reach. And the reaching you did was genuine, and it was enough. It was more than enough. What was not enough was him. I left some things in the cabin. You'll know what to do with them. The most important thing I want to say is this. Stop protecting him at your own expense. Stop being smaller than you are so he can feel larger than he is. You have always been the biggest thing in every room you've entered, and you have spent years hiding that because it seemed like the right thing to do for the people around you. It was not the right thing. It was just the habit. You are 72 years old or close to it, and you have a life that is entirely yours, and I need you to live it that way. I love you. I'm sorry I ran out of time. Thomas. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading. I did not fall apart exactly, but I let myself be with it, with all of it, the grief and the recognition, and the particular ache of being told by someone who has gone exactly what you needed to hear and could have used a great deal earlier. I let the tears come because they were there, and they were earned, and denying them would have been another version of making myself smaller than I was. Thomas Marlowe, the most practical, understated, quietly perceptive man I had ever known, leaving letters in locked boxes in mountain cabins because he understood that some words need to wait for the right moment. He had been right about the moment. After a while, I got up and washed my face and put the kettle on. I stood at the kitchen window in the fading afternoon light and looked at the yard, snow-covered and still. The bare branches of the oak tree Thomas had planted as a sapling 20 years ago, now well past needing anything from anyone, deep-rooted and steady. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Gerald. Arraignment scheduled for Monday. Call me when you're ready. No rush tonight. Another buzz. Mara. Home safe. You? I typed back, home safe. Read it. He was right about everything. Her reply came after a moment. He usually was. Get some sleep. I made tea instead of sleeping. I sat at the kitchen table where Thomas and I had eaten 10,000 meals, where Caleb had done his homework as a child, where I had sat alone for 8 years learning the particular shape of a life without its center. I held the cup and I thought about what came next. Not all of it, not the court proceedings and the media and the long work of rebuilding what had been taken. Just the immediate next. The next day, the next week. There was the porch railing that needed fixing. I had been meaning to call someone about it for 6 months and had not done it, which was a small and manageable thing and suddenly felt important, the way small, manageable things do when you have just survived something large and unmanageable. There was Patricia, my financial advisor, who needed to be fully briefed and whose careful warnings over the years I intended to tell her, directly, that I should have listened to sooner. There was Sandra Cho's phone number in my recent calls, and the conversation I had said I would have about what happens to people like me and what can be done about it. And there was the cabin, which was mine, which had been the place of the worst night of my recent life, and also, impossibly, the place where Thomas had reached across 8 years of death and told me exactly what I needed to hear, which held both of those things simultaneously in the way that places do when enough has happened in them. I thought about what to do with the cabin for a long time that evening. I did not come to a conclusion that night. The conclusion came later in the way that real conclusions usually do, not as a decision made in one sitting, but as an understanding that develops slowly and then arrives so naturally that it feels like it was always there. But the seed of it was there, at the kitchen table, with Thomas's letter and my tea and the winter dark settling over the yard, and the oak tree standing in the snow with its deep roots and its bare branches, patient and permanent, waiting for another spring. The porch railing got fixed on a Wednesday in January, 3 weeks after the cabin. I want to tell you that because it matters in a way that's hard to explain, not the railing itself, which was a simple repair that a carpenter named Walt completed in under 2 hours for a fair price, but the act of calling him, of picking up the phone and saying, "This thing has needed doing for 6 months and I am doing it now." It sounds small. It was not small. It was the first in a series of decisions I made in the weeks after December that were all, in their various ways, versions of the same choice. To stop waiting. To stop organizing my life around the needs and potential reactions of a person who had demonstrated, conclusively and at significant cost to me, that he was not going to change. The arraignment was on a Monday, as Gerald had said it would be. I did not attend. Gerald advised against it, not because I wasn't entitled to be there, but because he said, with the particular candor I had come to rely on, that there was nothing in the courtroom that morning that I needed to witness in person, and that my energy was better spent elsewhere. I trusted him. I stayed home, and I called Patricia, my financial advisor, and I had the conversation I should have had 2 years earlier, in which I told her plainly that her warnings had been correct and that I was sorry I'd taken so long to act on them, and she was gracious about it in a way that made me understand she had been waiting for that conversation for a long time without ever pushing for it. "What do we do now?" I asked her. "We rebuild," she said simply. "It's not starting over. You have more than most people your age have, even after everything. But we restructure, we tighten, and we make sure the protections Gerald put in place stay current." A pause. "And Evelyn, I want to say something directly." "Go ahead. You did the right thing. The hard thing and the right thing, which are often the same thing and rarely feel like it at the time." She said it without sentimentality, which is exactly why it landed. A lot of people in your situation don't act until it's too late. You acted in time. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. In time. The phrase carried weight in both directions. The relief of having moved before the loss became total, and the sorrow of every month and year before April, when I had not moved, when I had adjusted my definition of acceptable instead of drawing a line. Both were true. I was learning to hold both at once without letting either one erase the other. The charges against Caleb were formal by the end of January: financial fraud, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, elder endangerment, 2 counts of document forgery. Gerald walked me through each one without dramatics, which I appreciated. The case was strong. The documentation we had built was, in his words, unusually complete for this type of case, which reflected not exceptional legal skill, but 8 months of a woman forcing herself to look clearly at what she had been refusing to look at and write it down. There was a moment, about 2 weeks after the arraignment, when Gerald called me with something unexpected. "Caleb's public defender has been in contact," he said. I was at the kitchen table, same table, different morning. The light was thin January light, not the December kind. "And?" "He's asking about the possibility of a plea. Not to all charges. They'll fight some of them. But the core fraud counts and the elder endangerment. He wants to know if you'd be willing to make a statement at sentencing." I was quiet for a moment. "What kind of statement?" "That's entirely your decision. Some people in your position speak to the harm caused, which adds weight to the sentencing. Some speak to mitigating factors. Some do both." Gerald paused. "I won't tell you what to say, Evelyn, but I want to make sure you understand you have that option and that the court takes these statements seriously." "I know," I said. "I'll think about it." I thought about it for 2 weeks. I want to be honest about what that thinking looked like, because it was not a peaceful process. It was not a matter of sitting quietly and arriving at wisdom. It was more like being in a room with 2 versions of myself simultaneously. The version that had loved Caleb for 30 years and still, in some cellular and involuntary way, loved him now, and the version that had spent a night in a freezing cabin and knew with absolute clarity what he had been willing to do to me. Those 2 versions of me did not agree about much, but they agreed on this. The truth mattered more than the outcome. I called Gerald back on a Thursday morning and told him I would make a statement. "Do you know what you want to say?" he asked. "Not yet," I said, "but I will." Well, it was Mara who helped me figure out what I wanted to say, though not in the way you might expect. She didn't sit with me and help me draft it. She took me to lunch at a diner we'd been going to for 15 years, a place with vinyl booths and coffee that was consistently too strong, and a pie case in the front window that rotated the same 6 varieties in the same order every week. And she talked about something else entirely for an hour and a half. She talked about a case she'd worked 20 years earlier. A woman in her 60s whose adult son had been forging checks. The woman had refused to cooperate with the investigation, had told Mara and her deputies that she wasn't going to be the reason her child went to prison. Her son had been charged eventually on the basis of other evidence, had served a short sentence, and had come out and done almost exactly the same thing to a neighbor woman 18 months later. The neighbor woman had not been in a position to protect herself the way I had been. She'd lost nearly everything. Mara told me this story without looking at me while she told it, just looking at her coffee, turning the cup, speaking in the measured way she had. When she finished, she said, "I'm not telling you what to think about your son. I'm telling you what I've seen happen when the people with the clearest view of what someone is decide their love is a reason to stay quiet about it." I looked out the diner window. The January street was gray and cold, and people were moving through it with their heads down, wrapped against the weather. "It's not about Caleb anymore," I said slowly. "Or it's not only about Caleb, it's about the next person he would have done this to." "Yes," Mara said, "and about all the people it's already being done to who don't know they can fight it." "Yes," she said again. I picked up my coffee. "I know what I want to say now." She finally looked at me, the corner of the smile. "I thought you might." I spoke to Sandra Cho of the County Register in early February. Not a brief comment this time. A full interview in Gerald's office, with Gerald present, conducted over the better part of an afternoon. I told her the story. Not every detail. Some things remained mine, but the shape of it, the essential truth of it. A mother, a son, a long pattern of taking that had been enabled by love and by the particular shame that attaches itself to family exploitation. which is different from other kinds of exploitation because it comes wrapped in relationship, in history, in the complicated mathematics of what you owe the people you are supposed to love. I told her about the cabin. I told her about Thomas's box. I told her about Gerald's trust restructuring and what it had prevented. And I told her about Mara driving 2.5 hours in a mountain blizzard with coffee and a sleeping bag and a recording device, because that part of the story seemed important for people to understand. That surviving something like this is not a solo act. That the preparation mattered and the allies mattered equally, and neither one was sufficient without the other. Sandra Cho was a careful reporter. She asked good questions, and she did not push for the emotional details that would have made the story more dramatic and less true. When it ran, 3 weeks later, it was accurate, and it was clear, and it was, as these things go, not sensational. Just a woman's account of what had happened to her and what she had done about it. The response surprised me. I received through Gerald's office, because Sandra had been careful not to publish my direct contact information, letters. Paper letters, most of them, which told me something about the demographic they were coming from. Older people, women mostly, some men. From this state and from others, telling me versions of their own stories, some ongoing, some past, some just beginning. Asking questions I didn't always have the answers to but tried to respond to as honestly as I could. One letter has stayed with me. It was from a woman named Dorothy, 78 years old, who wrote in handwriting that had the slight tremor of age but was still legible and direct. She said her daughter had been managing her finances for 4 years, and she had been afraid to ask questions because she was afraid of what the answers would be. She said reading about what I had done, the documentation, the legal preparation, the trusted ally, the willingness to look at what she'd been refusing to look at, had given her what she called the language for what I've been living with. She had made an appointment with a lawyer. I read that letter at the kitchen table, and I held it for a long time. That woman, whoever she was, sitting in her own home, writing to a stranger about fears she'd been carrying alone, she was why Sandra Cho's article needed to exist. She was why my own discomfort about being a public story mattered less than the story itself. I wrote back to Dorothy. I told her she had done a brave thing. I meant it. The sentencing hearing was in March. I had written my statement by hand, the way Thomas had always written things that mattered. I went over it with Gerald once, not for legal approval. It was my statement and my words, but because I wanted another pair of eyes on it for clarity. He changed 2 words and approved the rest. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I don't know what I had imagined. Something more formal, more weighty in its architecture. What I found was a room that was clean and functional and filled with the ordinary business of consequence, which turns out to look much like any other kind of business. People seated, papers arranged, proceedings conducted with procedural language that strips the human drama down to its structural elements. Caleb was at the defense table with his attorney. He looked thinner than he had in December. Not dramatically, but noticeably. He was wearing a suit I didn't recognize, which meant he'd borrowed it or bought it secondhand, which told me something about where things stood for him. When I came in, he looked at me once and then looked at the table. I had thought about that moment, the first sight of him in the courtroom, quite a bit in the preceding weeks. I had prepared myself for a range of emotional responses. What I actually felt was harder to name than any of the responses I'd prepared for. It was something in the range of profound, exhausted sadness. The sadness not of what had happened between us, but of what had never happened. The relationship we had never actually had, the son he had never quite managed to be, the mother I had kept trying to be to someone who experienced my love not as a gift but as a resource. That sadness was real. I let it be real. I didn't use it to excuse anything. When the time came, I stood. I held my 3 pages of handwritten paper and I looked at the courtroom, and for one moment I looked directly at Caleb, who was looking at me now, and I held that look for long enough to make it mean something. Not a threat, not a plea, just a recognition. I see you. I know exactly what you did. I am still standing. Then I looked at my pages and I read. I won't reproduce the entire statement here, but the heart of it, the part that mattered most to me, the part I had worked and reworked in the weeks before, was this. I said that my son had exploited my love and that this was true, and that I would not minimize it. I said that the financial loss was real, and the violation of trust was real, and the night in the cabin was real, and that all of it had consequences that extended beyond what could be measured in dollars or charges. And then I said, I am not here to destroy my son. I am here because what he did to me is done to elderly people across this country every day, and most of them never see a courtroom because they are too ashamed or too afraid or too in love with the person who is hurting them to name what is happening. I am here because naming it matters, because the woman who receives the next letter from a stranger about her own silent suffering deserves to live in a world where this is named and addressed. I am here because my silence would not have protected my son. It would only have protected his ability to do this again. I said that I hoped the consequence would be meaningful, not in a vindictive sense. I was careful about that, because vindictiveness was not what I felt, and I was not going to claim a feeling I didn't have in order to perform a version of victimhood that felt more complete. I hoped the consequence would be meaningful, because I had seen in Caleb's face when he read Thomas's letter something that looked like the beginning of reckoning. And reckoning, to be real, needs to cost something. Comfort cannot produce it. Only consequence can. I sat down. The courtroom was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than the procedural silences around it. Gerald touched my arm briefly. Just once. I looked straight ahead. Caleb was sentenced to 4 years, with eligibility for parole consideration at 2, contingent on completion of a court-mandated financial counseling program and full cooperation with the restitution process. Restitution, a formal, legally binding payment schedule, was attached to the sentence, structured around what Gerald had documented as the provable financial loss from the 8 years of exploitation. I want to be honest, 4 years sounds significant, and the restitution sounds concrete, and both of these things are true, and neither of them gave me what I think people expect a legal outcome to give you. There was no moment of catharsis, no sense of scales balanced. What there was, when the judge read the sentence and I sat in the courtroom and heard it, was something quieter and less satisfying and more real than catharsis. A sense of things being in their proper place, not fixed, not erased, but properly placed. Caleb said nothing when the sentence was read. He nodded once, slightly, as if confirming something he had already arrived at on his own. His attorney spoke briefly. Then it was over in the procedural way that these things end, and people moved, and papers were collected, and the ordinary business of the building resumed around us. I stood in the hallway outside with Gerald and Mara. She had come, of course, because Mara Quinn does not leave people to face important things alone. And I did not feel triumphant or devastated or any of the big emotional things I had spent the last months bracing for. I felt tired, the kind of tired that is not a complaint but an accounting. The bone-level exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down, and whose muscles are still shaped around the weight of it even after it's gone. "Are you all right?" Gerald asked. "I will be," I said, which was the most accurate answer I had. Mara handed me a bottle of water, which was so characteristically her. Not comfort, not words, just the practical thing the moment required, that I almost laughed. "What now?" she asked. "I have a contractor coming on Thursday to look at the cabin," I said. "About the heating system." She looked at me. "You're keeping it." "I'm converting it." In fact, the idea had come to me fully formed sometime in January, the way ideas do when they've been developing in the background of conscious thought for weeks without announcing themselves. I had been thinking about Dorothy's letter, about all the letters, about what Sandra Cho had said when we spoke after her article ran, that the response had been the largest reader response to a local story in her 3 years at the paper, about what I had said in the courtroom, that this happens to people every day, and most of them never see a courtroom. And I had thought about the cabin, sitting empty on its mountain in the aftermath of everything that had happened there. And I had thought about what Thomas had put into it, the preparation, the forethought, the quiet insistence on making sure that the people he loved had what they needed, even when he wasn't there to provide it. What would it mean to make the cabin into a place like that? Not for me, for others. The Marlow Mountain Refuge opened in October of the following year. It was not glamorous. Let me be clear about that because I have a suspicious relationship with anything that presents itself as complete or perfect, and the refuge was neither. It was a property that had been substantially rebuilt over 9 months. Proper insulation, reliable heating, 3 additional rooms added to the original structure, a generator system that actually worked, a small common kitchen. The conversion had been funded partly from my own estate and partly from a nonprofit status that Gerald helped me establish, which opened the door to grants and donations I hadn't expected. The refuge provides temporary housing to elderly people in crisis situations, those who have been displaced by family exploitation or are fleeing unsafe living situations, or who are caught in the gap between independence and institutionalized care where there is currently very little support. It runs for 4 months of the year, closed in winter because the mountain is genuinely inaccessible in serious storms, and I have no interest in creating a situation where people are trapped, which was a design principle that came directly from personal experience. The other 8 months, it operates quietly and practically, staffed by a small rotating group of volunteers that Mara, with her network of former colleagues and community contacts, helped recruit. It was not my original vision for what the cabin would be, but it was Thomas's in a way. He had built a place of preparation and refuge for the person he loved most. I had extended that logic outward. On the day of the soft opening, before the official programs began, before the first residents arrived, I drove up the mountain alone. It was early morning, late September, the air just beginning to have the particular cold edge that precedes true autumn. The aspens along the road had gone yellow, and the light through them was the kind of light that makes you stop moving for a moment just to be inside it. The cabin looked different. It looked like itself, but larger, better tended, more purposeful. The new rooms added a wing to the right of the original structure. The porch had been repaired and expanded. The window I'd looked out of on that December night, the one that had been white with storm, through which I'd seen nothing but my own breath in the cold, now looked out on a cleared area with a bench and a fire ring and 2 young pine trees that had been transplanted from further up the slope. I sat on the porch for a while before I went in. I thought about a lot of things, sitting there. About Thomas, who had built this place with his hands and his evenings and his particular brand of quiet love. About the night I'd sat inside it trying to keep a fire going with 3 logs. About Caleb, who was in a facility 2 hours south of here in a room I had never seen, working through the first year of a sentence that had been, I still believed, the most truthful thing I could have given him. About Dorothy, who had written me a second letter in June to say that she had met with the lawyer and had begun the process of protecting herself, and that it was hard but she was not alone, and that she wanted me to know. About all the people I didn't know, the ones who hadn't written letters, the ones still in their homes adjusting their definitions of acceptable, still telling themselves it would change, still protecting people who were not protecting them. I thought about what I would say to them, if I could. Here's what I would say. I am 72 years old and I have made every mistake a person can make on the spectrum between loving someone and being consumed by them. I have confused endurance with loyalty. I have confused enabling with generosity. I have looked at evidence and chosen not to see it because seeing it required a response I wasn't ready to make. I am not telling you this because I overcame it cleanly. I did not. I am telling you because I overcame it at all, and at the time it seemed impossible, and the fact that it wasn't impossible is the only thing worth passing on. Your love for someone is real even when what they're doing is harmful. Those 2 things coexist, and pretending they don't is what keeps people silent. Naming the harm doesn't destroy the love. It just stops the love from being used as a weapon against you. You have the right to protect what is yours. Your home, your money, your dignity, your body's safety on a winter night. These are not negotiable things. They are not things you owe anyone in exchange for being loved. A person who makes you pay for love with your safety is not loving you. They are taking from you, and the fact that they may have loved you at some point does not change the arithmetic of what is happening now. And this one is hardest, and I know it is hardest because it was hardest for me. You are not the solution to someone else's brokenness. You cannot love a person into the wholeness they refuse to work toward themselves. I spent 30 years trying. I have the documentation. What you can do is build something real with what you have left. It may look smaller than what you imagined. It may look nothing like what you planned, But if it is built on what is actually true about your life, rather than what you wished were true, it will hold. That was what I would say. There. I went inside the cabin. It smelled different now. Fresh lumber and paint over the old pine smell. The smell of a place that has been remade for new purposes. The cast iron stove was still in the corner. I'd been insistent about keeping it. The Windsor chair was there too, repaired properly for the first time. A craftsman in town had done it, found matching wood, made it right. It sat near the stove where Thomas would have kept it. The steel box was in the small office we'd made from part of the kitchen. On the desk, where people who needed it could find it. Inside was a new version of Thomas's practical list, updated for the current state of the property. Emergency contacts, frequencies, where things were, what to do if. I had written the list myself. On the desk beside the box was a framed photograph. It was the only photograph I'd brought from home for this space, and it was not, as you might expect, a photograph of Thomas. It was a photograph of the mountain taken from the cabin porch, from the first spring after Thomas died when I'd come up alone to be close to him, and had stood on the porch in the May morning and taken a picture because the light was doing something I'd never seen it do before, and I didn't want to forget it. Blue sky. Snow still on the peaks. The trees in the first real green of spring. I had chosen that photograph because it was the place, not the person. Because what mattered about this cabin was not the grief it held, or even the love it held, but what it had proven capable of. Shelter, preparation, survival, and now this. New purpose, warm walls and open doors, and a list on the desk of where to find what you need. I stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then I did something that will probably seem small and is, and also isn't. I went to my coat pocket and took out Caleb's old cabin key, the one he had used to open the door the morning he drove me up here to abandon me. Deputy Reyes had returned it to me along with the other personal effects that had been cataloged. I had kept it without knowing why, for almost a year. I knew now. I crossed to the cast iron stove. The fire was already laid. Whoever had prepped the cabin before the opening had done it right, the kindling arranged in Thomas's method, and I lit it with a single match. When the fire caught, I held the key over it for a moment. Not out of ceremony, not out of drama, out of the simple need to mark a thing clearly, that a door he had closed on me was now permanently open to people who needed it, that the key he had carried as a symbol of his access to my life and resources was going into the fire because that access was finished, and in its place was something he hadn't intended and couldn't diminish, and had, in the end, accidentally made possible by forcing me to a point where I had nothing left to do but finally, fully, stop accommodating and start building. The key was small. It burned briefly, and then it was just metal in the stove among the ash in the beginning of the fire. I sat in Thomas's chair. The fire built itself up the way fires do when they've been laid by someone who knew what they were doing, and the warmth began to move out from the stove in real waves, and the cabin filled with it the way cabins fill. Slowly at first, then all at once, until the cold is just something that exists outside the walls, and the inside is its own separate world. I sat there for about an hour before I drove back down the mountain. I want to tell you that this is a story about what my son did to me. It is. But it is also a story about what I did, about the years I spent choosing not to see, and the 8 months I spent choosing to see, and the December night when seeing became the only thing that kept me alive, and the year after that when I turned what I had seen into something that could hold other people's weight when they needed it to. It is a story about Thomas, who loved imperfectly and prepared thoroughly and ran out of time, but not out of forethought. It is a story about Mara, who drove 2.5 hours in a blizzard without being asked, because that is what it looks like when someone genuinely loves you. It is a story about Dorothy, and about the other people who wrote letters I will never show anyone, and about the women and men in rooms all over this country who are adjusting their definitions of acceptable, waiting for the moment when the adjustment becomes impossible. I want to say to those people directly, the moment comes. It is survivable. What you build on the other side of it is yours in a way that nothing built on accommodation ever was. And I want to say this one last thing because it is the truest thing I know. My son left me in the cold and thought it would silence me. He did not know that the cold was the last thing I had left to survive, and that surviving it would leave me with nothing left to be afraid of. He did not know that the woman he'd been slowly diminishing for 30 years had been, the entire time, more than he could see. He didn't know that the cabin that was supposed to be my ending was going to become someone else's beginning. That is the surprise he left behind when he drove away in the dark. It was never about the money. It was always about this.